I want to put something on the record before anyone edits it in their head. There are pictures I will never show, texts I have saved, and a speech I heard in a room full of people that sounded like the end of me. I can still smell the coffee from that morning, bitter and burned, and see the light sliding off a brass nameplate like it was the last clean thing in the world. Later, someone will call what happened to me poetic justice. Today, I just call it the moment I stopped being invisible and started moving. I built my mornings around three things: the smell of diesel before sunrise, a cup of coffee that was never as good as I wanted, and the faces of the men and women who trusted me to keep them safe. You learn to read people the way you read blueprints. I can tell which guy will hold a beam steady under pressure and which machine won't start until you whisper to it. On site, I am not a boss in a suit barking orders. I am the one who untangles problems no one else sees. I remember the day a roof truss shifted while we were lifting it 2 stories up and every foreman I knew was out of town. I climbed a ladder, wedged my shoulder under a trembling joist, and talked 2 cranes through a half-inch of give. The crew laughed afterward like we had survived a bad joke. They didn't laugh the day after because sheets of plywood were stacked wrong and the shipment was gone. I found a mill open in the next county, paid for the rush, slept in my truck, and still handed the client a finished job 2 days late with a refund and a smile that felt like a lie. They still called me first the next time their house needed work. I was raised on scaffolding and metric bolts. My father used to lift me up to the line of sight over a foundation and say, "One day you'll know every nail like a friend." That promise was not a metaphor for me, it was my map. I turned down college scholarships because my father said the real world was the best classroom. I watched more sunsets from rooftops than from balconies. I stayed when girlfriends left because the weight of a legacy felt heavier than loneliness. I learned to estimate steel like a language and to work a nail gun so it felt like a part of my hand. When my friends at 20 were asking what they wanted to be, I was already writing bids on lunch breaks and patching stucco after midnight. When they backpacked, I was shuttling materials and making sure the payroll hit on Friday. Every sacrifice was an IOU written in sweat with my name on it. People around me thought I was just efficient. The clients thought I was punctual. My crew thought I was family. My father called me his backbone with that dry smile he reserved for men who earned his trust. I answered calls at 2 a.m., negotiated with impossible suppliers, and showed the municipal inspectors where corners could be rounded without breaking code. I learned to be calm in that messy, beautiful chaos of a job site because panic makes people hurt themselves. I bet on stability. I bet on the truth that work done well speaks for itself and that honesty, for craftsmen and clients, is as valuable as a signed contract. I became the person who could sit in a cramped trailer and make 20 people believe in a plan. People followed me because I paid attention to their kids' birthdays, because I remembered the old guy's back would give out before noon, because I found overtime for the single moms without asking. Loyalty in construction is not a poster. It is a paycheck, a dry jacket left at the trailer door, and a man who arranges the coffee. There are things a company name can buy and things it can't. My value wasn't the title on my business card. It was the network of trust I had earned with calloused hands and honest invoices. Clients signed contracts because they liked how I talked through problems. Crew members stayed because I told them the truth about overtime and kept my word. That kind of capital is quieter but far heavier than any balance sheet line. I had watched our trucks pull out at dawn and come home at night with guitars and lunch pails. I had stood on roofs with guys who swore by me, and I had taken a bullet of blame more than once to keep a job together. It felt like a promise fulfilled every time a client handed me the keys to another house and said, "Build it like you would for your daughter." I tell you all this because the story does not start with betrayal. It starts with me on a job site, with my sleeves covered in mud, the radio low, and the crew trusting my call. I was not dreaming of revenge or planning exits. I thought my life was a slow, steady rise to a corner office with a window that overlooked our yard full of trailers. I had plans that would have made my father smile in the way he used to, not the way he was about to smile when he would change more than just a name on a door. But there are doors you think are yours because someone promised them, and then there are rooms where promises are read out loud, like a will you thought was private. I remember thinking, the day everything shifted, that I had been keeping the company alive for someone who would never recognize its heart. The room smelled like frying onions and new paint, a weird mix that made my stomach twist because it was the smell of endings and parties my whole life. We had dragged plywood tables into the old warehouse, strung up lights between I-beams, and parked a row of our orange trucks outside like soldiers at attention. My father stood in front of a crowd made of the crew, some clients, city inspectors who hated us and loved us in equal measure, and half the neighborhood who'd come for the free barbecue. He held a microphone like a preacher, and there was a cake with our logo on it. I had rehearsed my speech in my head with a dozen different finishes, expecting a handshake with a worn leather palm and a key to the office with my nameplate on it. Instead of that key, what I got was the sound of my life being read out loud like a long, polite eulogy for something they were about to bury. He started with the laughter, old stories about how I used to hide in the tool van and sleep under insulation. He made the crowd laugh and I let myself relax for the first time all day because he was kind. He always was when it came to memory. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a yellowed folder, and I remember the way the light caught the brass nameplate on his chest, the plate he always polished on Saturdays until it shone like it had a pulse. He turned to me and his eyes were kind, the kind that had built a small empire and also a house of habits. I thought I would be named. I thought he would tell them the truth that everyone already knew, that without me the word we had been purely aspirational. Instead, in a voice soft enough to confuse people for compassion, he said my name and thanked me for my service. Service. Like I'd been a temporary manager, like I'd been keeping a chair warm for someone else. The room tilted. The man who had lifted me onto foundations at 5 years old called me an employee in front of 40 people. There was a pause long enough for my heart to rearrange itself. Then he smiled as if closing a book he had written and announced that the company would be led by my younger brother. He said, plain and small, as if it were the most reasonable thing in the world, "Your brother needs this chance." The words hung there soft and ridiculous, and the noise in the room turned into a kind of thick static. People who had followed me for years looked at each other, at my father, at my brother, and I saw confusion and the first sneaking thing that looks like pity. My brother stood to the side in a shirt that did not fit him right, his hair combed like he was auditioning for a lifestyle magazine. He held a paper cup and smiled the way people smile when they are waiting for a moment they have practiced. He had failed at a dozen ideas over the years. An art studio that never sold a painting, a food truck that closed after a week, an app that had 2 downloads and 1 review that said, "Would not recommend," and yet here he was in front of our crew being handed a kingdom he had never sweated for. The word needs was like a nail being driven through my ribs. I tried to laugh it off because what else do you do when your life is televised in your hometown? I stepped forward and cleared my throat, heart loud enough to drown out the band. "Dad," I started, and I felt the old instincts rise like concrete poured into a mold. Explain the work, remind him of the nights, the calls, the bids turned in at dawn. But he raised a hand, the same hand that had once steadied my shoulder on a bad roof, and he said it had been decided, he had thought about it carefully. He told a story about my brother's struggles, about how people needed second chances, about how families bend to lift those beaten down by bad luck. He made it sound like mercy. To me, it sounded like a justification picked off a sympathy shelf. People clapped because that is what you do when a man who built a thing announces a change. I heard the clapping like rain on a tin roof, polite and inevitability filled. Around me, old mentors avoided my eyes and younger guys looked like their hands were suddenly too heavy with what they had to do tomorrow. A woman from accounting, who had watched me argue with unions and keep benefits intact through 2 bad winters, touched my arm once and then withdrew like someone who is allowed to witness trauma but not to interfere with it. My brother walked up to my father and hugged him with a practiced tenderness that felt like a curtain dropped between us. In that hug, I saw both relief and calculation. It was the first time I noticed his eyes flicker toward the ledger folder on my father's hat box. People afterward would say there must have been a legal trust or a secret clause in the will. They would say my father was saving something for someone who had nothing. They would say a man of his age could be sentimental. But the truth that lodged in me was much simpler and much colder. He had erased a lifetime of sweat with a phrase meant to sound noble, and he had done it in front of everyone. That night I went home and listened to the party through the thin wall of our trailer. Every laugh from the warehouse magnified like a clock ticking down a debt. My hands shook, not because of anger at first, but because a life I had planned around had been refiled under someone else's name with a voice that said empathy as if it were a coin. Later would come the calls, the whispers, the lawyers, and the bargains. Later would come the revelation that my brother had not simply been chosen for pity, but for a reason that smelled of oil and the sort of deals my father pretended were beneath him. For now I stood in a yard full of trucks and watched men shrug and move as if the ground were settling. I had given my entire life to what my father had built, and the first public sentence after he retired called me a servant. That night the word servant echoed in my head until it started to feel like a dare. I did not yell, I did not plead. I set the keys down on the plywood table like I was leaving a dinner plate at the end of a long meal. The brass on those keys had been worn smooth by my thumb for 20 years, the teeth filed by 10,000 locking and unlocking. My hands did not tremble when I pushed them forward. My voice did not crack when I said, "I wish you luck." Saying it felt like telling a lie you had practiced until it tasted like metal. I turned away from the circle of faces, from the plastic banners and the barbecue smoke, and walked out into the yard where our trucks sat lined up like exclamation points. People watched me go, some looked away. Some kept clapping as if applause could glue anything back together. My father stood with his hand half raised, caught between authority and affection, and my brother was already grinning like a man holding someone else's lottery ticket. Outside, the cold air hit me because it always hits differently when a roof isn't overhead. I could hear the band through the wall, the music trying to stitch an ordinary evening back together. I walked to my truck and pressed the hood of my hand to the metal like it would steady me. I thought of the first time my father let me hold a hammer and how proud he had been that I didn't drop it. I thought of every storm we worked through and every client who had trusted my number. I thought of the word he used, service, and how small it sounded when it came from him in front of a room full of people. I drove without a plan because the truth of that night shut down the part of me that used to plan. I found the highway is a good place for thoughts to unstick. Sleep did not come easy. I slept in my truck at a rest stop with my boots still black from the day, the radio set to static. I listened to the noise of the world and it felt obscene, ordinary life carrying on while everything I thought I owned was being refiled. At 3 in the morning, my phone buzzed on the passenger seat like a live thing. I turned it over. It was Marco. Marco had been with me longer than anyone else, a foreman with a laugh like gravel and a record of never quitting, not even when the bank called and the roof leaked and the job site was a joke. He was the best foreman because he could read a crew the way I read blueprints. When he called, the night shifted. I answered before it finished ringing. The first thing Marco said was not hello, but you out there, boss. His voice was low and the word boss landed like an old habit trying to find its place in a new sentence. I expected the awkwardness, the small condolences. Instead he said, we are coming with you. I stayed still in the truck like the steering wheel was a confession. Marco told me the truth in pieces that fit together like broken glass. He said the men and women I worked with had been sitting around tables in the trailers, passing the cans back and forth and talking about the party. He said they had taken my father's speech not as mercy but as theft. He said they remembered who arranged the overtime, who came to kids' birthdays, who fought to keep health benefits when the books said we were bleeding. He said loyalty, plain and stupid and expensive, had a line drawn around my name. I let him speak. He gave names like bullets. He said Jenna from Concrete would be ready to sign next week. He said Omar, who runs the heavy equipment, had been waiting for me to give him a reason to leave. He had 2 kids and a mortgage and the exact kind of tired hero my father liked to tell stories about. He said even the old-timer, Pete, who never takes sides and who has been laying bricks since Nixon had hair, was ready to walk out and take the secret field notes out of the files. Marco's tone shifted and something darker came in around it. He told me he'd overheard a meeting at the county building where my father and my brother had laughed about streamlined permits and a buyer who would pay cash and not care how corners were cut. That was the first real crack. The suggestion that the thing my father had built was being sold, not passed, and that my brother was not simple incompetence but an instrument. When Marco said, we trust you, and paused, the pause was a loaded thing. He asked me straightforward if I wanted to start something. He used the word start like it was a good thing, like it could be a new honest ledger. I thought of the kind of company I wanted, one that paid properly, that treated safety like a religion, that fixed mistakes with more attention than excuses. I thought of clients whose kids had eaten birthday cake at our job trailer and of the small towns we had repainted and rebuilt. In the dark of my truck, I felt something unfamiliar and stubborn rise up, rage braided with opportunity. I was not ready to be the man who took the keys off the table and shrank into a shadow. If what I had spent my life building could be denied by a word in public and a handshake in private, then I would build again and better. Marco asked if I had a name yet for what could come. I smiled because naming things was half the job. No, I said, but I like the sound of honest work. He laughed, the gravel clattering into a grin, and told me to meet him at the old diner at dawn. He promised a roster and money saved from overtime slush that could rent us a single van and a phone line. He told me clients had already been waiting for a call because my number was the one they kept. The plan felt reckless and small and immediate, like the way we used to live through storms. I hung up and the truck hummed under me, and for the first time that night I could imagine taking the cruise and showing the town what true work looked like. I drove through a city that slept unaware that its future foundations were being decided in the back of a pickup and on a diner napkin. My father had offered pity and a last breath of charity. At dawn, we would answer with competence and a list of willing hands. I remember the exact sound of the bank machine when I drained it, like someone slow clapping the end of an anthem. I cashed in what I had, my college fund that was supposed to be spent on my son's schooling someday, the watch my mother gave me, a beaten-up stereo that still played records loud enough to wake a whole street. I sold the motorcycle I'd promised myself I'd ride across the country one summer, and I moved out of the trailer that smelled permanently of sawdust and coffee. Within 30 days, I had a name painted on a cheap sheet of plywood nailed above a garage door, Honest Work Builders. It was a stupid name and the best thing I could think of. It fit like a shirt you can't quite get off because it was exactly what I wanted the company to be. We had one van with a dent on the bumper, a borrowed office behind a greasy spoon, a phone line that lit up when my hand covered it, and one contract the size of a neighbor's kitchen. That first month felt less like building a business, and more like assembling a band from the dregs of a storm. Marco showed up on the first morning with his coffee and a smirk like a man who'd had his life in the wings for years and finally got called. He brought Jenna and Omar with him, and the three of them walked into the little garage like generals walking into their new headquarters. Marco had grease in his hair and a permanent crease in his forehead that spelled responsibility. Jenna had her hands scarred from pouring and finishing concrete, and she wore a bracelet with nuts and bolts threaded like beads. Omar smelled of diesel and winter, and he carried keys like they were charms. They sat around my one-used folding table and made a list that was half jobs and half promises. We put together pay scales that actually let a person feed themselves and their kids, and we wrote safety standards into contracts like scripture. We wrote the word respect next to benefits and circled it so many times it almost bled through the paper. They left the old company because their hands were tired of being taken for granted, because they were tired of watching me be thanked for service in public and then watched me be left out of decisions in private. They left because they believed my voice when I said we would do things differently. That faith was heavier than any startup loan could have been. Our first three jobs were small and honest. A flooded basement for a retired schoolteacher, a kitchen that needed gutting because a pipe had burst in a January cold, and a church ramp that had been on the city's list for 2 decades. We did each job like it was the last thing we would ever be lucky enough to do. We bought good nails and paid for the right permits. We showed up on time and we left the sites cleaner than we found them. Mrs. Alvarez cried when we handed her the keys and said she felt safe again. The church pastor asked me to say a few words at Sunday service about community, and I told the congregation that real work is quiet and patient and that a lot of it is just keeping promises. Word traveled. People who'd once driven past our trucks in characterless haste started watching for us. They talked. The oddest part was not how fast the jobs stacked, but how the old clients came with coffee and money and a kind of hungry gratitude that tasted like redemption. They brought references like offering plates. There were twists I didn't expect. The top 3 crew leaders didn't just bring their skill, they brought secrets. In boxes under Jenna's truck, we found old invoices and spreadsheets that had been quietly passed around like proof of a crime. Someone had been skimming overtime into a phantom account, and the ledger led to names connected to my father's new board advisor. Marco admitted he'd seen the advisor's van parked by the warehouse more than once after dark. Omar produced a file with permit stamps that smelled like rubber and attorney impressions. Someone had been fast-tracking permits through a small network of officials who preferred cash to forms. Their anger was not just wounded pride, it was righteous fury at being used. Suddenly, our little company had leverage beyond good workmanship. We had truth. We could go to a council, we could file complaints, we could expose a plan to sell off maintenance contracts and replace local crews with cheap labor tied to an outsider investment. The old company had always been more than trucks and bids. It was a spine for a neighborhood, and someone was trying to pull it out and sell the body for parts. My father did not take our departure as a gentle rebirth. He called me and tried to guilt me into returning with promises that smelled like bribes. He sent men with envelopes and smiles, offering the same job back but with fewer benefits and a clause that would have required me to hand over client lists and non-compete papers like trophies. He didn't see that I had already traded those pieces of paper for something less legal but more lasting: the loyalty of the people who actually held nails and made walls stand. He accused me of betrayal in a voice that had once called me backbone, and I felt the thinness of a word that had been convenient to him. I told him we compete fair and square, building a reputation on quality and truth, not on promises read aloud in a decorated warehouse. By the end of the month, our van had a hand-painted logo, the phone rang with steady inquiries, and a county inspector who owed me a favor winked when he saw our permit. We bid on a municipal job to repair the park pavilion. Ironically, the exact project my father's company had intended to use as the feather for a buyer's pitch. We went in with a bid that was honest and lower because we weren't padding for boardroom lunches and because the best workers on the bid had hearts for the town, not hireling pockets. The council looked at us like we were kids until they looked at our ledger and the client references we handed them. When the mayor announced our name, the room shifted. I felt a small, tight satisfaction that was not about revenge but about justice. I had been told I was a servant and given the keys as if to say thank you for your labor. Now those keys opened a different door. The foundation we poured in that small first month was not just concrete and rebar, it was a new kind of contract with the people who kept this town honest. The calls started like a trickle and then became a river. At first, it was a neighbor with a sagging porch who had always waved as I drove by, then a church lady who remembered the way I fixed the stained glass frame after a windstorm. They were small at first, things you expect to come back when you do honest work. Then the calls turned into emails and then into people standing in front of my little garage with plans clutched like confessions. They would say my name and then tell a story about a time I had shown up when no one else did, and then they would ask me to bid. The funny thing was that they didn't call because my name was on a plywood sign or because my prices were low. They called because somewhere in their memory I had been honest with them, and that had become worth more than any slick brochure. Word spread faster than any flyer. One of our bids came from a woman who owns half the row of storefronts on Main Street. She de-used my father's company for decades until the night of the retirement party when she had watched me walk out with the keys. When she called me, she said, "I want you because you care about my windows like they belong to someone you know." Her projects were not small. She needed a full facade restoration and she wanted it done in stages so her tenants could keep their businesses. That kind of trust requires not just competence but patience and respect, and we priced it fairly and promised timelines we could keep. We won that bid and it showed people that choosing us wasn't a gamble, it was insurance. The real exodus happened when three old institutional clients reached out at once. The County Parks Department, a private elementary school, and an independent hospital called my number directly. These places had been contracts my father's company had held for years. They called me because behind the curtain people had been asking around who had actually been doing the clean work. Inspectors, nurses, janitors, ordinary people with long memories had been whispering my name. I remember the park's superintendent saying, "We don't want a company that cuts corners and takes speed over safety." I told her plainly we never have. We bid low because we don't have to pay fat boardroom lunches. We bid fair because our crews deserve steady work. When the county awarded us the pavilion repair and the school hired us to replace playground equipment, the rumor solidified into reality. Clients were choosing accountability over old names. Each win fed the next. When one of the hospital's administrators walked past our shop to watch men unload steel, a nurse she recognized ran out and hugged Marco like the man was family. The hospital then recommended us to a rehabilitation center that was planning an expansion. A restaurateur who had once sponsored my father's charity gala came to the site with a coffee and watched Jenna smoothing concrete, and later he told the local food blog that he refused to work with anyone who treated people as disposable. The blog piece spread like wildfire. Suddenly our van was not just another vehicle. It was a symbol of dignity, of a promise kept. My father's company tried to respond. They discounted projects aggressively and sent glossy brochures through the mail, but clients who had worked with me called back. They said things like, "We want the people who showed up for us when others didn't." That line carried weight. Contracts that once felt untouchable shifted like sand. I remember driving past our old warehouse and seeing trucks idle in the yard, their logos looking smaller than they used to. Men I'd worked beside for years were filing out of that place in small groups, shaking hands and saying good luck not to my father, but to me when they recognized me across the street. Watching that slow migration felt less like triumph and more like justice arriving on its own timetable. There were tests. My brother tried a smear campaign, calling clients to suggest I would cut corners, to imply I was unstable, that leaning on loyalty was an amateur move. It was petty and it was transparent. One client laughed openly on the phone and said, "We watched you walk out and we watched him smile. We know who kept the lights on." Another twist came when a developer tried to buy my silence with a contract that promised expansion and cash up front if I'd stop pursuing municipal bids. I did not need the money to know where the line was. I refused, and the developer tried to use his influence to stall our permits. He failed because people who had been helped by our crews stood up at hearings and spoke in my favor with more force than any lobbyist could muster. Every contract we won changed the story the town told itself about us. We were no longer just the angry son who left a family business. We were the builders who fixed the hospital roof, who replaced the school playground, who kept a church bell tower from collapsing in a storm. Our reputation for quality became more than a phrase, it was our advertisement. People began to call, and not just for work but to offer help, to refer longtime clients, to protect our crews from corner-cutting inspectors. The exodus was not an event so much as a peeling back of a curtain. When the dust settled, our trucks were on the road more days than not and the old company's yard was quieter. I had set out to build a business on respect and honesty, and the town had decided that was worth paying for. The only sound louder than the drills and saws on our sites was the quiet of a promise kept, echoing down every street we fixed. I watched it happen like you watch a house settle into a bad foundation, slow at first, then with sudden, ugly cracks. My father kept the brass nameplate polished and kept smiling at people as if a smile could paper over a lean-to. My brother started with small things that felt ridiculous until they were. He bought a new SUV instead of a parts van, paid for a midweek night at a strip club and called it networking, and hired an office manager who spent more time posting selfies than answering client emails. The warehouse smelled different, like cologne and new credit cards. Men who had once come in covered in concrete dust began to show up looking alien to the place, like actors who had watched a movie about contractors and decided to copy the costume instead of the work. Projects began to slip. Deadlines that used to come with careful phone calls and contingency plans turned into excuses and silence. A retail facelift my father's company had promised for 3 months showed up on the front page of the town paper because the new paint started bubbling and peeling within days. The restaurant owner called me in the middle of the night because the cheap flashing had let water through the fascia and ruined brand new shelving. My own crews fixed what we could because I couldn't stand the idea of families losing income because of shortcuts someone else had taken. Fixing their mistakes while getting blamed for letting them down felt like a new kind of labor. Quality plummeted like a dropped ceiling tile. My brother had found a guy who would supply cheap materials, and he had a way of telling suppliers to cut corners that made them nod and do it. Nails that bent, joists that were undersized, fasteners that were the wrong grade, small technicalities that become big problems when wind or rain or time comes knocking. Inspectors started calling our old warehouse and asking questions. There was a public reprimand for one of his job sites where scaffolding had been improperly tied off. The report was a list and it read like a mercy. No one was hurt this time. The line "no one was hurt" started to appear more in emails than I liked. The worst of it was how quickly the people left. Loyalty is not a one-way street. The same men who had stood beside me on cold mornings began to walk through the warehouse doors carrying small boxes of things and resumes folded into their shirts. They left for companies that offered more stability or for sites where foremen actually checked helmets. I lost guys I had taught how to set a plumb line. I watched them go with a grief that felt like losing tools at work, irreplaceable, practical, necessary. The leaving sped the rot up like a leak opening up a wall. Without those hands, the work got worse and the claims got louder. And then there was the night that made everyone stop pretending this was a hiccup. A multi-unit townhome job my father's crew had been contracted to finish for a developer started to collapse outward when a temporary brace gave way. Nobody was supposed to be on the scaffolding at that hour, but a young apprentice had been sent to overnight a pump. He called 911 with the kind of breathless voice you don't forget. The scaffolding groaned. One of our trucks had been parked down the street on an unrelated job, and Marco and Omar were there with half their crew after midnight. They showed up before the department could and helped stabilize the structure enough for the rescue teams to work. If Marco hadn't been there, we would have had more than a headline. People began to talk about who was doing the right thing when the wrong happened. My brother tried to spin it as a supply chain issue and then as bad luck. He started to threaten clients with price hikes and board members with resignation drama. He called my father and promised to tighten operations. Tightening meant cutting wages, benefits, safety checks. I started getting calls from former clients who had been burned by his cheap fixes asking me if we would take on the work to make it right. My answer was always the same: we will fix it right and charge what it costs. That honesty cost us some bids, but it earned us the trust of people who mattered. He was losing bids, lots of them, to us, and he hated it. I remember the way his face changed when a municipal packet arrived and my company's name was at the top. Humiliation makes men reckless. He began to flirt with shortcuts beyond bad plywood, agreements that smelled like favors and offshore labor who couldn't pass local inspections. A developer who had once laughed at me offered my brother a fast contract if he would turn over certain service agreements and allow subcontracts that effectively outsourced the work to crews paid below code. My brother took the deal. The town council started to notice patterns of complaints coming in after the work was done: leaking joints, doors that wouldn't close, steps that sagged. That pattern bled back to the company that used our name for decades and now could not keep its hands on basics. What hurt most was watching my father defend these choices. He would sit in the office and tell anyone who'd listen that he had to modernize, that this was the way of the world, that the company's longevity required risk. He defended my brother with the harsh tenderness of a man who doesn't want to admit he's been wrong, and every defense sounded like another hammer hitting a weak board. Sometimes late, I would sit across the street from the warehouse and watch him through the office window, hunched over spreadsheets he didn't understand, and I felt a strange and heavy pity. I wanted to be vindicated, but not like this. I'd never wanted him humiliated. I wanted him to see the truth before it ate the thing he loved. The rot had another side, a kind of testimony. Each failure my father's crew produced sent more clients calling our number. Each cheap job that peeled or leaked drove more people to us for salvage work. The town began to separate names from faces and choices from promises. My brother's mismanagement didn't make me gloat, but it made our work necessary. I felt anger for what had been taken, a careful satisfaction in doing it right this time, and a worry that this would not end quietly. Rot invites more rot if nothing stops it. And I started to suspect what had seemed like simple incompetence might have roots in greed that could reach further than a paint job or a pay stub. We were on the third day of a municipal job fixing the old community pool when they showed up, like two men who had lost a map and finally remembered where the river ran. The sun was high, the concrete still curring, and children were already sticking their heads through chain link to watch. I was up on the ladder, sleeves rolled, and I heard the gravel in the drive crunch differently when their truck pulled in. My father climbed out slow, his cap in both hands like a man arriving at a church he had ignored for years. My brother walked beside him with that uneasy grin that always said I have something to hide. They looked smaller in the bright light than in my memory. The warehouse had shrunk them, or maybe their choices had. When my foreman saw them, they tightened like cords. Marco muttered something about time, and my crew straightened with the kind of quiet that says trouble is coming. They didn't bother with small talk. My father walked up with the sort of humility that has been practiced in front of mirrors and lawyers. He said my name and stumbled through an apology that sounded like a draft he hadn't finished. My brother, who still smelled faintly of expensive cologne and poor judgment, cut in and asked me if we could meet in private. He used the word partnership as if it were a gift rather than a leash. They offered terms on the back of a restaurant napkin, a partnership where I would oversee operations, where they would keep board seats and control of the finances, where I would sign a 2-year non-compete that meant I could never use my own client relationships the way I had. They had frames for it, professional phrases to make me look like the child who needed to be coaxed back into the sandbox. They still didn't call me the owner. They called me the solution. Inside that simple offer was everything that had always been wrong. They wanted me to fix what they broke while they kept the trophies. They wanted my hands and my trust ledger to polish a brand they had dulled. My first impulse was to throw the napkin in the trash and walk off the site, but there was something worse than anger quietly sinking me into consideration, pity. My father's shoulders had a tremble I had never seen when he thought no one was looking. He kept apologizing the way people who have burned something keep apologizing with a match in their hand. My brother's eyes moved constantly between my men and the contract, like he was measuring leverage. I found myself feeling the old obligation, that thread tied from me to him by decades of power drills and shared sweat. I did not want to be cruel. I did not want to be the man who left a hull to rot when it could be saved. But I also didn't want to be a tool in their hands again. While they spoke, I noticed people gathering, not nosy neighbors, the clients we'd saved and the crews who had walked off the old job. Mrs. Alvarez stood by the fence with her cane, and the park superintendent leaned against the lifeguard chair with arms crossed. My men formed a slow line behind me like a spine. Marco's jaw jumped, and Jenna folded her arms so the bolts on her bracelet caught the light. It hit me then that this was not just about a business. It was about who we allowed to steer the town's work. The sight of those faces hardened something in me. If they wanted me back to save a legacy, they weren't asking for my help as a son. They were asking for a public performance to hide a private mistake. My father went softer then, and he brought out a story about history and family and trust. He said, "We can do this together," like a preacher trying to knit a congregation back after a fight. He said he had made mistakes, the sort that lonely men make when they think a ledger can replace a handshake. He promised reform and oversight, a board shuffled like cards and benefits restored like gifts. My brother leaned forward and said, "We need you to legitimize us, to calm the town down before investors swoop in and take it all." The word investors made the air sour. It became obvious they were not coming because they suddenly loved truth. They were circling like vultures, ready to buy the name cheap if we didn't step in. They wanted me as a Pied Piper to lure trust back so they could sell the whole thing to someone who paid cash and forgot about the people who actually did the work. I felt something cold and bright click into place. I heard the ledger of invoices again, the files Jenna had smuggled from under her truck. I remembered Marco's voice saying he saw the advisor's van at night and the county inspector's whispered concerns. I felt the weight of the town behind me asking for me to be consistent with the promise I had given. I also felt my father's face like a map I had loved and wanted to save without being used to save it. I could see every angle, humiliation, pity, leverage, and I knew what they thought, that I would relent because blood and hometown still meant something. They still saw me as someone to be bartered with, not as the rightful owner they had promised to. So I listened to them, and I let them finish their rehearsed lines until the sun had dipped enough to throw our shadows long across the wet concrete. I told them quietly that I would think about it, the only phrase a man can use when he needs to buy time before he either gives or takes back everything. My men watched me with something like breath held. The town watched through fences. My father took my hesitation as hope and my brother took it as an invitation. They left with the soft, desperate hope of men who have already planned their escape route if refused. As their truck faded down the road, I felt both sick and clear-eyed at once. They had come asking me to be the broom that sweeps up their mess, and in the hollow where my old promise had lived, I felt the first forming of a counter-promise, one that would either restore what was stolen or burn the whole frame down so something honest could be built in its place. I told them no in a calm voice that surprised even me. I could see the relief in my father's face empty the way a man exhales when he needs to keep breathing. My brother's smile froze in the middle like a cracked light. I said plainly, you want a partnership that lets you keep the trophies while I patch your leaks. The legacy you care about is money, I told them, and the legacy I built is the quality of my work and the loyalty of my men. The words sat between us like old lumber stacked too high, and for a second the only noise was the distant thump of a jackhammer. They tried to bargain with nostalgia and guilt, two things my town had given me plenty of. My father offered me a title and the office with the window. My brother tried cajoling, then threats, then sly promises about cash and connections. I listened because I owed him 20 years of listening, but I had also learned to read motives the way I read grain in wood. None of their offers addressed the rot I had seen or the men who had been paid less and left with empty pockets. None of it repaired the ledger that listed bribes and fast-tracked permits. So I walked them through what would happen if I agreed. I would inherit debts, make promises I would have to keep to people who belong to me now, and stand as the public face while private hands skimmed from behind the curtain. I would not be their curtain. After they left, the town did what towns do when a truth is out in the sun. The ledger Jenna had smuggled became the central piece of a complaint we filed at the county office. Marco met with a local reporter who had a small following online, and the story grew teeth. The advisor my father had joked about was revealed to be tied to a development group that planned to gut local jobs and ship work to cruise miles away. The permit stamps in Omar's folder exposed a pattern of favors and a few too many apologetic emails when inspectors asked questions. It was not a slam-dunk courtroom drama. It was slower and more painful. It was a collection of small proofs knit into a pattern that showed long-term negligence and deliberate shortcuts. My father called me in the weeks that followed like a man trying to hold onto an old map while the landscape changes. He apologized more sincerely than he had in years, and he told me things I had never been told about pressure from investors, about threats that had been whispered in boardrooms. He sounded smaller and also like a man finally admitting the truth out loud. I felt something I did not have a name for at first, relief mixed with a grief as sharp as a chisel. His choices had started a chain that threatened to sell his name to anyone with cash, and I would not be a footnote in that story. I offered him instead something practical: come and work with us in the field if he wanted to learn how to save what he had nearly lost. He refused at first, then came by one morning with sleeves rolled and a cap hiding his shame. A year slid by like concrete curring, slow, careful, and irreversible. My company grew because we did things right and because the town had chosen to reward integrity. Our books were lean and honest, and our crews stayed because they were finally treated like the skilled people they were. The old warehouse changed hands several times before the bank finally foreclosed. My brother burned through cash and apologies, and the advisor quietly took his share and vanished with a new title elsewhere. The bankruptcy filings were public and ugly. They named unpaid subcontractors and suspicious transfers and left families wondering what would happen to their pensions. It was a bitter harvest of choices that had been voted on in board meetings and paid for in community trust. When the assets went to auction, I stood in the back of the county hall with a $2 coffee and a quiet that felt like prayer. The room smelled like old paper and stale coffee and the low mutter of people deciding who gets what. The auctioneer read off lots, a set of trucks with faded logos, a stack of client files, the old office furniture with the brass nameplate my father had polished for decades. I bid what I had saved by selling things I did not need and by refusing a developer's contract that would have compromised our standards. The bids rose and fell, and some strangers eyed me like I was a fool, but the town had already decided to back us. Clients showed up and whispered to the clerk, "Please let him have it," and others nodded like they were witnessing an old debt paid. I won most of it for pennies on the dollar. The brass nameplate, the trucks that ran smoother with a little love, the files that would let us call former clients and say we were righting wrongs. These things were mine now by the legal weight of a stamped document and by the quieter weight of a town that remembered who did the real labor. Signing the papers felt less like victory and more like a settling of accounts. I met my father afterward in that same old office. He watched me sign with a face that was a map of regret and surprise. I offered him the chance to come back and learn, and this time he accepted. My brother was gone by then, out of town with his pride and an empty ledger. The final twist wasn't that I stole a throne, but that I reclaimed one by refusing the shortcut they offered. I had been promised a crown in a speech and denied it in a party. I had built a new life on the backs of honest men and then let the town help me buy back the bones of a thing that had been hollowed out. When I nailed the brass nameplate back on the office door, it looked different. It was dented and worn, and I polished it once, not to make it shine, but to show its scars. I put my hand on the wood and thought of all the mornings with diesel and coffee and of the faces that trusted me. Finally, legally and morally, what was rightfully mine sat under my palm, and the promise I had been raised on was no longer a thing whispered in a corner. It was a contract I signed every morning when I drove the trucks out and looked at the crew waiting in the yard, because my legacy had never been a name in polished brass, but this time the name matched the work.